Hi, my name is Kevin Loftus, and I'm going to give a talk that I first gave in the Mary Robinson Climate Conference last week called Why Sustainability Isn't Enough and the Call for a Regenerative Future. I'm one of the founders of ACT, which stands for Accelerating Change Together. We're a social enterprise of architects, designers, policy specialists who have come together to try and find answers for the challenges facing the built and natural environment. We started off as a core team of 3 people and have now grown to a team of 7. We're based in Ballina on the west coast of Ireland, but also have a foot in London. ACT was set up to accelerate the green transition, to inspire change, and to help realise a beautiful future, because we're very aware that the future we want to bring people towards needs to be aspirational. We need to bring people on a journey with us. We design buildings and we create urban design projects. We also develop visions and strategies, working at the scale of towns, cities, community groups, or even working with companies. And we develop digital tools and perform policy consultation. This allows us to work locally while being informed by a global agenda, but then also to work globally being informed by our local practice. I mentioned the reason we set up was to accelerate the green transition, and the reason that's important is because we're really coming to a very dangerous point in human history where we're physically changing the makeup of the atmosphere and the Earth's geological and biological processes. The North Pole now is melted during the summer. In 2001, villages in Germany went from this to this, and from this to this. Last year, we had the worst drought in Europe in over 500 years, leaving the continent scorched. And last week, we had the hottest day on record globally, followed by a new record hottest day. Altogether, it being the hottest week globally ever recorded. So climate change is beyond any shadow of a doubt real, and it's accelerating rapidly. The reason for this is that since the Industrial Revolution, we've pumped over 2,500 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. At our current rate, according to the IPCC, we would exceed the 1.5 degree threshold, which is considered a minimum to minimize the worst effects of climate change within 9 years. If we are to stay below that target, we need to rapidly decarbonize our society, and that's across the globe. So we need rapid reductions in carbon outputs, basically globally becoming carbon neutral by around 2040, which is earlier, as you may be aware, than many of our targets and plans account for. If everybody was to pollute and emit emissions the same way we do in Ireland, we would only have 5 years within which to exceed the 1.5 degree target, and 18 years to stay within the 2 degree target, which is, by all accounts, a sort of catastrophic depiction of the future. Relative to other European countries, we're the second highest emitter, and if you count for anomalies in the way Luxembourg's emissions are accounted, you could say that we're the worst emitter in Europe. So why are our emissions so high? Well, if we have a look at the breakdown from the EPA, and we have a look at the four key areas, the four largest emission sectors, we have residential, energy, transport, and agriculture. So let's take them one at a time. Residential, we have some of the most dispersed population in the whole of Europe. If you look at where people live in terms of our large urban centres, the towns and city, or the cities and capital make up about a third of the population, whereas the rest of the population lives in the large and medium towns, the smaller towns and countryside areas. So 2/3 of our people do not live in the larger population centres. And that's at odds with the rest of Europe, where very often it's the inverse, with 2/3 living in the larger cities and a third living in the more rural areas. In terms of our ways, our typologies for living, only 9% of people in Ireland live in apartments. We know that apartment living is much more efficient in terms of resources, in terms of energy, in terms of space even. Compare that to the European average of 46%, we can say we're well below that. That means we've a large portion of housing stock that is inefficient and needs to be retrofitted. And that needs to happen rapidly with a wartime effort needed if we're to meet the targets needed to stay within our emissions goals. As well as that, we know that there's a housing crisis, and the government have planned for the last 2 years and between then and 2030 to build 33,000 homes per year. So that's a huge increase on the building stock, but it's important to take into account that those numbers have been predicted to be underestimations, with other estimations of up to 50 and even 60,000 between now and 2050 being needed. If we look at how we've built over the last decade, typically it has been the 3-bed semi-detached house. That contains around 40 tons of carbon. If we were to build that way in response to the housing crisis, that would be 33,000 homes per year using that typology, and over 8 years we would reach 10 million tons of carbon. So that's a huge output of carbon when we need to be dramatically reducing our emissions. Now, in terms of transport and linked to the dispersed population that we have, we can see that Ireland has nearly 21 kilometres of road per 1,000 people. The European average is just under 10 kilometres per 1,000 people, and the German average is nearly 3 kilometres per 1,000 people. So by those figures, we're the highest in Europe, and we're the highest by a sizable margin. Because of that, and because of a lack of public investment, our public transport provision is very poor in urban areas, but particularly in rural Ireland. Add to that the fact that we have some of the highest transport fares in the world, and that the service is unreliable, and it's no surprise that the Irish have the second highest car dependency in the EU. Where does the money go when we look at transport? In terms of road and cycle infrastructure, just over 10% goes to cycle infrastructure, and the remaining near 90% goes to road infrastructure. That's maintaining and upgrading the roads, but that's also building new roads in a time when we need to be changing the way that we travel. Ireland's near 10% investment in road or cycle infrastructure is at a historic high, but despite that, only 40% of that funding was drawn down last year. So there's a mismatch between our climate ambitions, where we're putting money, and how that's being applied on the ground. As well as that, when we do build or consider cycle infrastructure, we often think of it as tourism infrastructure rather than essential mobility infrastructure. The next point is energy. Having a look at our overall breakdown, we can see that 11% of our energy comes from renewables. To put that in context, in relation to our 2030 targets, we have some of the lowest application of that across the EU. That's despite the fact that we have some of the highest wind potential in the world, especially offshore. We haven't seen a take-up in solar cooperatives the way we have in other European countries like the Netherlands or Germany, and these cooperatives can provide sustainable finance to local communities. We also see that the agriculture sector in terms of energy is being untapped relative to our European neighbours. The potential to increase anaerobic digestion should happen quickly and could have a major positive impact for our agricultural communities, also with the added benefit of reducing waste. So the next topic, naturally moving on from that, is agriculture. If we look at Ireland's land use, 2% is artificial, so that's roads, buildings, other infrastructure. 13% is forest, and included within that are areas of nature or natural areas. 15% is wetland, 2% is water, and the remaining 67% is for agriculture. Of that, around 2% is used for vegetables, 4% for cereals, and then the remaining 60% is for pasture or grassland. So that's for grazing sheep, for grazing cows, the larger livestock animals predominantly. If we have a look at the amount of inputs for a kilogram of beef versus a kilogram of wheat, beef is 16 times higher in terms of land use. So it's a very inefficient way of producing food. In Ireland, we have over 7 million cows. We have just under 6 million sheep. So that makes a total of over 13 million of that larger livestock type. At the same time, we have just 5 million people. And we know that apart from the emissions in terms of methane that comes from cattle, they also have a negative impact on the wider environment. So the water quality, the need for fertilizers, all of this means that the negative impact of cattle on our natural environment is huge. And what we produce in Ireland, 90% of that we export, most of that being meat and dairy. However, we import 80% of what we need. So that's fruit, vegetables, cereals, agri-food, and animal feed. If you're to look at that by tonnage, you see that we actually import much more than we export. So even though we have this idea that Ireland is producing food to feed the world, we're importing more than we export. And of that, around 20% of what we import goes to feeding that livestock that then is exported either as animals or as products. So agriculture makes up 38% of Ireland's emissions. It uses 67% of our land, but amazingly, it only makes up 1.2% of our GDP. This is a number I found quite surprising myself. I don't take GDP as necessarily a good indicator for well-being or for judging the success of a country, but even with that in mind, 1.2% is a very low number, and this number has come from Teagasc, so it's the representative body of agriculture's own figures. Despite all of the emissions and all of the land use, we're still vulnerable when it comes to food security because of the way our system is set up. So it's absolutely essential that farming is part of the solution and the response to climate change, but the way the system is currently set up will not do that. We know that Ireland's temperature is rising at current rates. By the time we hit 2050, we'll have a similar temperature, annual temperature that they have in Brittany in France. So we're seeing radical and fast change in this space, and we will need to adapt to it. We also will need to adapt to the fact that population in Ireland is going to increase by about a third from 2017 to 2050, and that will be the second highest increase in Europe. So where can we go from here? There are two major forms of practice: degenerative, harming the Earth's ecosystems and its ability to support life, and regenerative, repairing the Earth's ecosystems and its ability to support life. Within that, we have conventional, which is within the law. We have green, which is less negative impact. We have sustainable, which is doing no harm, also doing no good. We have restorative, which is contributing to nature, and we have regenerative, being part of nature. We've taken those four key areas and given just some examples of types of practice that could be considered degenerative or regenerative. Within degenerative, you might be surprised to see things like electric cars, public transport. Once they consume a lot of materials and are extracted from the earth, they're degenerative. So even public transport, if that's not electric and renewable electric, then it's having a negative impact, albeit much less than car and private car transport. On the other side, we have restorative and regenerative practices. So that can include producing crops locally, regenerative farming techniques where we take carbon from the atmosphere and bring it back into the earth, building with materials that sequester carbon, keep it stored as a way to remove it from the atmosphere. Sustainable then are things that are absolutely needed for the well-being and the continuation of society, but they're not necessarily the panacea that we all think about. We absolutely need them. We need electric public transport. We need renewable energy produced, hopefully at surplus. We need to reuse our buildings rather than constructing new ones. But we also need restorative and regenerative solutions as part of our toolkit. We need a rapid decarbonisation of society. We need fundamental systems change. We need preservation and extension of nature. We need a drawing down and sequestering of carbon. We need community action and political courage. We need a collective vision. We need a collective vision for the future that we can all aspire to and contribute to and help realize. We need a regenerative future. The next step, I'm going to take you through some examples of different projects we're looking at, each of them with certain regenerative aspects, and then taking all of those together, showing how that might be applied on a larger national scale. The first project is called Ripple. This was part of a creative climate action call under Creative Ireland. Our response to that call was to co-design a solution that would turn the ubiquitous green space that you see in all Irish housing estates into a tool to deal with climate change. So within an area close to a river, we saw the potential for it to mitigate the impacts of heavy rain and flooding by storing water, while at the same time producing space for the locals and producing space for nature. The project was a collaboration between UCD, Centre for Irish Towns, Ballina Greentown, of which I'm a member myself, Renoch Ninale, a Galway artist, and Roisin Byrne. As well as that, the residents of Greenhills were the critical stakeholder in this whole piece. We ran a number of co-design workshops, 3 in total, where the community came engaged with us around the conversation or around the topic of climate change, highlighted the constraints and opportunities that existed within their estate to respond to it. We mapped all of those, and then the ideas that were developed, we produced visuals for them to communicate back to the residents what we had understood. And then these images were taken and evaluated and eventually scored to understand what was going to work in the context of the housing estate and what was going to work for the residents. Finally, 2 were shortlisted. They were evolved further, and that design was in the period of 2 months drawn up and constructed. So this was a project that was of the community, building their knowledge and understanding of climate, but also responding to their needs. This is how the project currently looks. So you can see it's starting to wild out. We're getting pollinator plants blooming. We're retaining water on site. We've created public space, and we've also created the potential for the residents to grow collectively, and they've been taking that up. The project was nominated for a new European Bauhaus Award, and amazingly, we were the first Irish winner of one of these awards under the category Reconnecting with Nature. The next project I'll take you through is called Scotch House. This is based on a site in the centre of Ballina. So as you can see, it has a frontage towards Pearse Street, the main shopping street in the town, and then backs on to what's currently under construction, the Ballina Innovation Quarter. So a site like this, which is in many ways common to a lot of Irish towns, has the potential for infill development, for reuse, for densification of our urban towns. The building itself was originally constructed in the 1920s, had a commercial space below with residential, the family living on top. That has since ceased to be residential, is currently vacant, but the commercial floors below are still active. Our client came to us and asked us to try and activate that site to unlock its potential, but in doing so to be aware of the perception that Irish people don't want to live in the centre of Irish towns. So creating a design that would challenge that belief and try and make a desirable alternative. To do this, we looked at all of the different tenant profiles, essentially cross-section of society in terms of age groups and different family situations. And what you could see is that they weren't being catered for with the current provision that existed within the town. So we looked at what essential needs or desires they might have, and by taking all of those together, we would be able to create an offering that would cater for all of their requirements. The main moves we made urbanistically: on the ground floor, we can see that commercial space below is already active. So we extended that activation towards the new military barracks. We also brought back those above shop units, so reusing the existing structure. In addition to that, we looked at bringing the qualities that people currently aspire to: the open space, the green areas, the potential to grow on site, and brought those into the centre of town. So you get a sort of vertical stack of urban to suburban as you move forward. We propose a new pedestrian connection through the site, bring in multi-generational living units, so a variety of different types to support different age groups and people at different stages of life. And that's all connected through a network of green spaces with public amenities that the residents would share. This is a view from that military barracks site, a view from the laneway looking up, and some of those shared gardens. The project is proposed to be made out of a straw panel system that's easily mounted, put into place, and can be demounted, so the whole thing is potentially circular. In terms of carbon, the project sequesters around 32 tons of carbon in total. So that's taking the panels, but all of the other elements of construction around it. It levels out at 32 tons of CO2 being stored. That's versus what would be around 400 tons of CO2 emitted had this been built out of block or concrete construction. Even in terms of the finish, we were looking at the principle of circularity, linking to the historic context, but reinterpreting that clay material as a tile that can be reused in future. So for us, it was crucial not just to create a building that's sustainable, but facilitates a sustainable way of living. So we've proposed to reuse and activate the derelict floors, create renewable energy on site, have greenhouses and native plant species, to create a new pedestrian laneway to encourage active travel, to have vegetable growing on site, to have shared gardens, of which we are 90% more than the shared space requirement, to build in a modular panelized system, providing green roofs and rainwater harvesting, to have a common house which could be used by the community for different events or for remote working, and within that to have a library of things. So residents aren't just sharing space, they're also sharing equipment that they wouldn't need to individually buy. So we're applying a more shared economy, circular economy approach. This is a view out towards the military barracks development and an overview of the project, which is currently going through the planning system, and we're hoping to get a positive feedback and result on this. Ireland's greenest town. So this is moving up a scale, still staying with Ballina. This is a project that is a collaboration between ourselves, the Mary Robinson Centre, the Chamber of Commerce, as well as other community groups that are driving a lot of the action behind it. The project looks at a people-centric Ballina, a circular Ballina, an ecological Ballina, a fit and mobile Ballina, and an energy-independent Ballina. And we'll look at a few of those aspects through the presentation. We analysed the town to understand where we were and where we are. In 2001, this was the footprint. This is the footprint in 2002, which is more or less the same as it was in 2008. So when we had the financial crash, that was the big growth period before that, between 1990 and 2008. Within that overview, we can see that the population has increased by 60% in that time, but the overall land area of the town has increased by 92%. So that tells us that we're living less densely, we're more dispersed, there's less people living in the centre of the town, and what we're creating is a sort of straitjacket around the town in terms of the way it naturally would have evolved. It's like ivy wrapping around a tree. But within the town's core, we still have a 15-minute walk zone, a 5-minute cycle zone, so very easy to move around. And on the wider ring, there are 30 minutes to walk from edge to centre, and a 10-minute cycle. All roads converge in the centre, which is no surprise, but a lot of the amenities of the town are on the periphery, so what that means is that everybody needs to move through the centre to go from one point to another. We have some connecting roads, and we have a lot of dead-end streets, and that's a marker of bad planning. You can see that there are 22 kilometres of main road, 5 kilometres of connecting road, and 30 kilometres of dead-end road. So we don't have a lack of infrastructure in town. We do have a lack of connectivity, and that is responsible for a lot of the congestion we see, especially during peak hours where there's traffic tailbacks on all main roads along the town. In terms of energy, we currently spend around €34 million a year across all uses: fuel, heating, electricity. To put that into to bring all of that together, we understand that the way the town has evolved is quite flawed in its planning, in its development and sprawl, but we do see the potential for this to become a pilot for the future. So the question we asked at the beginning was, how can we create a future-focused town that leads Ireland in the green transition? A town that's thriving at its heart, that implements all of the practices that we would want to see: the quality of space, the connectivity, inclusion, accessibility, to make a place that is livable and living. How we might approach that: this is the main road in Ballina, Pearse Street. It's not needed as an essential connection, so it's a through road, but there's other ways to move around the town. So this could be pedestrianised. We could bring people into the heart of the town, not just looking at it as a commercial centre, but looking at it as a place for recreation, a place that would attract people to come and live, and to have the identity and the stories of the people of the town reflected in the urban fabric. We also have a great network of laneways which currently act more as service routes than any sort of main circulation. But again, cleaning these up, we can make them attractive for people to move from point A to point B. We can program these spaces so that they're actually engaging, nice places to be. And with that, we can start to see the regeneration and reuse of the existing structures within the town. Along the River Moy along the waterfront, we can increase the biodiversity by managing those water's edges rather than having them cut down every month. During the summer, we can manage them to boost biodiversity and nature along the riverbanks. As well as that, we can bring people into this space and we can activate them. So having green connective spines that run along the waterfront from outside to inside the town, potentially even with a solar canopy. So what this might do overall in terms of a strategy, as mentioned, all of the roads are leading towards the centre, which is very congested. We have a lot of the amenity space that people want to move to on the periphery. So by adding a few small additional pieces of infrastructure, we could actually create two peripheral loops of the town that would be walking and cycling. We could also join those two loops to create one large loop of active travel infrastructure. That would turn a journey which might currently take around 35 minutes by bike to 10 minutes by bike. So you move it from being something that people won't do to have it as something that's actively desirable. People want to move through if they can use the infrastructure, if it's safe, and they will use active travel alternatives where they're provided. What that might look like from above, we have 3 green spaces along the river that could all be connected, these 3 green public spaces connected to create one large park that would link the town in terms of connectivity, but also symbolically bringing different areas of the town together that hadn't been linked before. In terms of green space, we already mentioned Ripple. This green space exists throughout Ballina and other towns. They can be improved to be more family friendly, to encourage activity and well-being, to grow produce on site, and to let nature back into our town centres. Looking at our housing stock in the 1930s, the 1940s, the state went on a huge house building project, and that was one of the main sort of founding projects of the state. If we were to take a similar approach to retrofitting, we could look at a lot of those houses that are essentially the same in terms of makeup. Using economies of scale, we can be much more efficient in retrofitting this old stock. So having a state construction company that would massively scale up our retrofitting efforts would push us towards a decarbonised future. We can also retrofit our infrastructure. We can encourage growth and biodiversity on site. We can change our roads from just being connectors to being shared spaces that mix connectivity but also public functions. And we can bring nature back into the centre of our towns, using nature-based solutions to deal with water runoff, to increase pollination, to create more beautiful spaces. Now to our energy. If we're to implement all of those changes in terms of retrofitting the existing building stock, changing habits in terms of mobility, we could imagine a reduction of up to about 1/3 of our energy use. If that was the case, then we would have to find the remainder 211 gigawatt hours of electricity, which would need to be renewable. And if we were able to do that, and if that was in community ownership, we would move from having an expenditure of 34 million per year to having those savings. So what that might look like to achieve the target, you'd be looking at about 20 wind turbines, or covering the town potentially in PV. So what's most likely is that you have a smart network of different options, maximizing the potential of hydro, which used to exist in the town, solar, even some biomass production, wind, landfill gas, using the anaerobic digestion capacity that could be created in this rural context to also add to that. And also looking at the potential of district heating and cooling. If we're anyway going to upgrade all of our road infrastructure, if we're going to prioritize walking and cycling and build our roads to meet that, why not also use this as an opportunity to update our heating and cooling infrastructure to meet the future challenges. From a mobility perspective, Ballina is in the centre of a number of settlements. It's part of a network and it's the central node in that. A cycleway has been built from Killala to Ballina, which gives a journey time of around 35 minutes. If we were to do that between all of the settlements, we would create a sustainable way of moving from Ballina to those other towns. Within them, we could have mobility hubs which would act as transit zones from one mode of transport to another. So as people would come from the countryside by car, ideally by electric car, they then transfer over to bike to move into town, or they use a park and ride system or a local bus that's going frequently. So especially in peak hours, we can substantially remove the amount of traffic that's going into the town, reduce emissions by having this transport network, this noding of different mobility hubs that would also connect to other settlements. So they act as a transfer zone. So what we do is we limit car usage within the centre of the larger urban centre. We use smaller urban centres as transition points to move from one to the other. But all the time we're improving the connectivity and increasing the capacity of public transport within this network, therefore further reducing the dependency on cars. This is an area of around 35 or 30 kilometres in radius, so it gives a good zone that we can decarbonise by implementing a more regional strategy. Once all of this is electric, then we've moved towards a more sustainable model of transport. The last substantial project I'll talk about is the bioeconomy tapestry. The linear economy, which we're currently all using and a part of, is a take, use, dispose model. That's leaving us with huge amounts of waste. Ireland has the highest plastic waste per person in the EU. This model also is very extractive. It takes raw materials from the earth and uses through high emission forms of processing different energy to create the outputs that are eventually thrown away. The circular economy learns from this. It's a revolution. It has a make, use, return model, but it still uses raw material inputs and still has waste outputs. The bioeconomy model goes one step further, learning from the circular economy, but using biomatter as input, returning not just the object, but also it can be returned in the form of bioenergy or fertilizer or compost. And when there is outputs, those outputs are biological, so there's minimal negative impact to the natural environment. This project is based in northwest Donegal, out on a peninsula On the site, during the late 60s to mid 70s, there had been vegetable production in large 8-acre greenhouses. They were producing fruits and vegetables for the market in Dublin. But when the oil crisis hit, the model was economically unsustainable and the site closed down. It has recently seen a rebirth as a horticulture and sustainability centre, with one of those old greenhouses remaining. On the site, they innovate in terms of heritage crops, looking at their genetic makeup and their resilience to climate change. They're producing local food. The site works as an outside and inside and in between type of space. It preserves nature. We've the corncrake, which is in danger of becoming extinct, with habitat designated on the site. The site is fallow at times. There's turning of the earth. There's growth. So there's transience at different stages. This is moving and ebbing with the seasons. The proposal or the brief was to build on the capacity of the centre, what's already there, and to create a research hub that would bring together researchers from different academic institutions, students, and enterprise all together under one roof to research and build capacity within the bioeconomy. We need to balance human activity, the agricultural component of the site, and nature. This is the existing condition, and within that we have our two protected areas, the blue being the SPC, Special Protection, SPA, Special Protection Area, and those are the areas that are designated for corncrake. The brief programme includes densification of the existing polytunnels, addition of a new acre greenhouse, addition of new production facilities, and the addition of a research hub. As well as that, we have the fields that exist on site. But putting all of this together, we start to get something that's potentially quite intensive and maybe missing out on some of the room for nature that more local forms of agriculture leave. So could we create a model that is the best of both, efficient while also leaving room for nature? To do this, we upgrade the existing road and we rotate the program to be perpendicular to this. That leaves over room for nature to infiltrate into the site. So we've really efficient areas of production, and then we've areas left over for that infiltration. We've developed room or habitat zones for the corncrake. We also have fixed pollinator borders, so offsets from those fields that are left towards pollinator plants. Then we have seasonal strips for pollinators, so these can shift as the different demand for crops changes. So within this we have regenerative crop farming that, using the principle of crop rotation, can be adjusted depending on yearly need. All of this is linked together with a landscape loop path, so creating a showcase for the bioeconomy with various activators, traffic drop-off, moving the project to a two-story development, which we're currently evolving. Within this, we will have events, research capacity, educational spaces, an apiary. We will have space for heritage demonstration, capacity to work outside, nature educational points, places and habitat for nature and educational trail, bird watching, EV charging zone. So we're required to provide a minimal amount of parking and we do that as electric EV with the expectation that that reduces as we move forward with a higher usage of public transport, which we're providing drop-offs for, and bike infrastructure. We're also currently developing the operational strategy, so how we get energy from the sun, how rainwater is harvested on site, how the soil produces food that can be used on site, the capacity or potential to heat the greenhouses through geothermal energy, and then taking the waste from all of these processes and bringing them together, tying them into a circular system that tries to minimize any waste. Can we imagine a regenerative Ireland? So using all of those principles, do they give us the basis for what a regenerative future might be? So the next step is to try and build on those and see where we can go. If we take that transport concept, that basic 30-kilometre node system, and we apply that to all of the towns in Ireland that are 5,000 people or above, including some areas that are geographically isolated but not meeting the target, we get something like this, where we cover the majority of the country. The places left over are by and large areas that are of nature value and not any population or very low population. We have an existing rail network that system could tie into. As well as that, we have freight lines that are currently not used for passenger traffic. We also have old lines that could be brought back into use. And by adding around 20% to that network, we could actually create a fairly extensive coverage of the country. Within that, we can have high-speed lines or services, both going towards Dublin and also in a sort of circular wheel. So we get this spoke and wheel model that would give a rapid mobility option, making that more attractive. If, for example, we were to implement a high-speed service that was at the same space as the TGV, you could go from Galway to Dublin in 70 minutes, where it now takes around 2.5 hours. And we know that a lot of Irish people are commuting over an hour every day, with the average in Dublin being an hour anyway. So if this system is electric, then you provide sustainable alternatives to car dependency. That electricity can be powered by the supergrid, which there are plans for already, and if that grid is extended, we can fulfill that real capacity of 50 million plus homes, producing more than enough energy for ourselves and also the ability to sell that back to Europe. But we also want independent energy production, because we want communities to benefit from the transition. So having energy co-ops and having local biogas production, which will also reduce waste. So we're creating circular models of waste disposal and energy production. Changing our land use to become more diverse. So we can increase our vegetable and crop production, increase mixed forestry, so managed forestry that will provide timber as an output, but would do it over longer periods of time, where you introduce a variety of native species, giving a positive nature value contribution. All of this will create more resources for the bioeconomy and more sustainable building products. We could still export 40% of what's produced on that grassland while meeting our own internal demand. We could export 80% of the vegetables and crops that we produce while still meeting our internal demand. And if we were to take the waste product, that's straw or hemp or any type of fast growing biomaterial, rather than pumping 10 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere to meet our housing targets, we could actually sequester that. So we create a product that local farmers can sell. It's locally produced, it sequesters carbon, and it helps provide warm, comfortable environments for people to live in. And then we can have increased nature. So we can be, because we have more productive forms of land use, you can give over space for nature. In this proposal, we have 30% designated totally as nature and 20% as nature value. So woodland areas that can have a commercial purpose, but are also built to add value to nature. Can we create a regenerative Ireland that is more collaborative, it's more local, more inclusive, more equitable, more diverse, more natural, more healthy, more active, more playful, more cultural, more beautiful? This is our ambition and our hope for the future. Can we go from being climate laggards to climate leaders? We would love to make this a possibility, and we would love to collaborate with anybody who would share this vision. I leave my details there. If anybody would like to contact me, we would be very happy to get engaged in conversation and see how we could deliver a vision like this. Thank you.